to Rate That Album, the podcast where myself, Paul Muad'Dib, and my co-host, Joseph Fremming, from the Jodown, tear apart or glorify albums every week. Every week we take turns picking albums, and this week I had the choice, and I picked Metal Machine Music by Lou Reed. Joe, before we get into that, how you doing, buddy?
Doing all right. The world's still on fire. Just trying to stay sane in all of it. So, how you doing?
Oh, about the same. At least I'm not Ted Cruz or a Texas mayor right now.
God. Well, their jobs are safe.
Cruz
is. Mm-hmm. He's not going anywhere.
This will be a little dated by the time you guys hear this, but just to remind you all, that shit happened. Don't ever forget.
Oh.
Right now, Texas is freezing, and Ted Cruz tried to bail, and a mayor tried to tell people to just live without water and power and food. The world's on fire. Speaking of world being on fire, Joe, what did you think of Metal Machine Music?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so this was an album, I think. I have thoughts on this.
Please.
There's elements I enjoy. There's elements. But my original thought is that this is an album where I think the myth of it far exceeds like the actual product. I was expecting something way more crazier after hearing about this album for years.
Mm-hmm.
What I was expecting, was like chaos of like machine noises and all that, which you get a little bit, but a lot of it's synth stuff. My big takeaway from this album, Metal Machine Music, is there's the DNA in this album of a lot of music I eventually, years later, I would be enjoying. And I think the two albums I think I really hear this influence on is the album Ghosts by 9 Inch Nails and Kid A and Amnesiac by Radiohead.
Okay. Interested you bring both those up. So let me ask you this, because you haven't done any research in this album, correct?
Nope. I just knew about it. I knew of it, working in record stores. There was always the infamous Lou Reed album.
Mm-hmm.
He did the, 1975. Was it, at that time, I can see this being like pretty controversial.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody releasing this album in 2021. You throw a dance beat behind it and have Billie Eilish sing over it, it's going to be a top 10 hit.
It's hilarious you bring that up. Okay. First of all, let's talk about it. It's only 4 tracks. So let's I'm going to move the order here. Let's talk about the album first, and then we'll get into the history of it, because that's going to take up a majority of our time versus us talking about the 4 tracks.
It's kind of hard to dissect it because it's a very ambient album.
Mm-hmm.
These songs kind of just blend into one another, except for when the parts end, and then the next part picks it up.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, and like I said, like the DNA for like a lot of music, I hear the DNA for industrial rock in this a lot. Like I can picture Al Jorgensen in 1975 listening to this and just being like, man, I could probably use something like this later on down the road in life with music, and hence ministry. So
I'm going to say this as well. People talk about this album and they say it's completely unlistenable. This is something I listen to all day today. It's just kind of in the background. And there is semblance. People talk about there's no semblance of anything in there. There is music in there.
There's melodies in there.
There is.
They're just buried a lot, but that's part of the interesting aspect of this album. Because I thought it was just gonna be noise, and I'm like, well, crap! Like underneath, like some of this chaos, like I'm hearing melodies on like a synth.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it, and it's a little bit of synth, but not really. Actually, it's really interesting how he made this. So I'm gonna start with Wikipedia. Metal Machine Music was the 5th studio album for Lou Reed. And I don't even know where to start. Let's start with the reception, I guess, because we kind of already touched that. People hated this album. All Music, Chicago Tribune, Rolling Stone, Record Collector gave it all 1-star reviews. Okay? Q Magazine featured had Metal Machine Music in its worst 50 records of all time, and they also gave it it was number 8 in their December 20 edition of Top 10 Career Suicides list, where it came in 8th overall. Now, while I was trying to find that list does not exist anymore online. Pop Matters, however, really interesting enough that we're talking about this album, 10 days ago put out their own list of notable career suicides and put this at number 1. Okay? Now, that's not entirely correct, though, because it wasn't really career suicide, and I'll talk about that. So, where did this album come from? Most of this information I'm going to be pulling from is from an article by James Gent of We Are Cult. Okay, so I want to source where I'm coming from. You're right. The mythos of this really overshines everything, and this is the best source I've found from direct Lou Reed quotes and direct conversations with Lou Reed. So what was
step in real? Yeah,
please.
Yeah. Again, this was an album I thought, honestly, I thought a lot, it was pretty benign again by 2021 standards, but I could see in 1975 people being like, what the fuck is this? I mean, because this came out after Transistor, right?
Yes. This came out after Transistor,
which was his kind of critically acclaimed solo venture after Velvet Underground.
Yes, and this also came out. Let me pull this out here. It came out before a couple of notable works of his. It came out Lou Reed Live,
before Coney Island Baby.
Yep, Rock and Roll Animal,
which one of my favorite. That's top 5 live albums for me. It's Rock and Roll Animal.
Well, Lou may not be happy with you about that, and we're going to get into that.
You know what? Lou's a prickly guy, and he's dead, so I don't give a shit.
He is. He is a very, very prickly dude. And that's where a lot of this comes from. So Lou Reed had put out this 1975 album, okay? And what was going on before that? In 1970, Lou Reed split up from the Velvet Underground. Arguably, they're one of the most influential alternative bands ever.
Let's also add, they did 2 albums after he left.
Yes, they did do 2 albums after he left. And
they're not good.
They're not good. And he kind of hooked up with David Bowie to do Transformer and Walk on the Wild Side. Then he had gotten permission from the record company RCA to do what he wanted to do. Next thing he did was Berlin, which is on my top 5 favorite albums of all time. I absolutely love Berlin. It's one of my favorite concept albums ever. And it's this really depressing album. It's considered in most factions to be the most depressing album ever made. Basically, it's a concept album about a speed freak and a prostitute. That's all I'm really going to give away. Well, RCA had a kind of a hard time with that one because their recent bestsellers were The Sound of Music and the Archie's Sugar Sugar. So when they handed them Berlin, they didn't know what to do. And they kind of pulled him back and said, you're going to do what we want you to do for a while. And that's when Rock and Roll Animal came out. That's when he had to change his. Remember when Lou Reed was going around with the blonde hair and everything? Mm-hmm. He was completely pulled in, and they put a giant leash on him. RCA did. If you listen to the Rock and Roll Animal album, there's a part where he left in the sound of a fan screaming "Lou Reed sucks" on the closing song.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love that album.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And then he came in and did Sally Can't Dance and all these other things. And RCA was just making this money off of him from these things. And Lou Reed was miserable. This is what he said. This is fantastic. The worse I am, the more it sells. If I wasn't on the record at all the next time around, it probably would have gone to number 1. I hate that album. Sally Can't Dance is tedious. Could you imagine putting Sally Can't Dance with your name on it? Dyeing my hair and all that shit? That's what they wanted. That's what they got. Sally Can't Dance went into the top 10 without a single, and I say, what a piece of shit. By this time in mid-1974, Lou Reed was ridiculously thin, boozed out, drugged out. He could barely stay on stage, actually, for Rock and Roll Animal. He was running literally on adrenaline and drugs and booze. And journalist Nick Kent recalled, "I've never seen a man so utterly paralyzed, so completely devoid of life while managing to keep breathing as Reed looked into the night. He was just absolutely messed up. He was bored. He became a parody of kind of like the Beastie Boys. He became a parody of what these songs were about. He became a self-induced parody. After doing all this stuff, the record company wanted another thing from him. And he's like, I've done all this stuff. Give me some more leeway again. He's like, okay, so that's where Rock and Roll Animal came out, was this live album. And he's like, all right, I'm going to do this. What became metal machine music. He said to this album, it's the only record I know that attacks the listener. Even when it gets to the last side, it won't stop. You have to get up and remove it yourself. It's impossible to even think when it's on. It destroys you. You can't complete a thought. You can't even comprehend what you're doing. You're literally driven to taking the miserable thing off. You can't control that record. All right. This was the deal, was that when he did Rock and Roll Animal and gave them what they wanted, they were contractually obligated to give him another album that he had free reign on, like Berlin. It was reported that he had to run into the men's room. Like, when he gave this album, he didn't stop. Like, he went into RCA and demanded to see Kenneth Glancy, president of RCA Records, and handed this to him. and after he did, he told his friends that he had to run into the men's room because he was going to explode with laughter knowing what he was handing them. Like, this made him so giddy. And the RCA Recs didn't know what they were going to do with it. And they tried to sneak it out quickly on their Red Seal label instead of RCA. But Reed put up a absolute fit saying, no, the contract says this comes out on RCA and I want a quadraphonic mix to boot. So this was like Lou getting back on not being. And as a matter of fact, it's the only album that was ever custom made for the 8-track format. If you look at what the tracks are, like how long they are, they're like something like 16 minutes and 6 seconds. He custom made this for 8-track in 1975. And he was even mad at the fans because he was mad with the fans that he had gained from all this stuff that he didn't want, this commercialness. He wanted to get to his independent roots. So when he made the album, he had put things on it like rock orientation, melodically disguised, i.e. drag. Like all these people that were into the drag rock that he was doing, he completely did this thing. He even said that on the back of the album. He copied from a hi-fi magazine. He made up the equipment on the back of the album. It's all bullshit. All this was him with his guitar amp, a shit ton of pedals. And then after recording it, he went through and adjusted the speeds and the pitches. It's not actually synth. That's all guitar sounds through all these different pedals with time alterations, which is a big feat when you think about it. In 1975, the sounds he got out of the guitar and that pedal. So, yeah, I mean, he even, like, inside the album, he made a statement essay with a few hints of where he was at the time. He wrote in things, that he thought that the people were listening to it, because when people got right after Rock and Roll Animal, people thought, okay, there's this metal machine music. This is going to be kind of like that. So it went down horribly. I mean, no one liked this. Critics hated it. It ruined his relationship with RCA and basically any other recording industry publisher at the time. And Lou loved it. And he even said, most of you won't like this, and I don't blame you at all. It's not meant for you. For that matter, off the record, I love it and adore it. I'm sorry, but not especially if it turns you off. I'm not going to apologize to anyone. They should be grateful I put that fucking thing out. And if they don't like it, they could go eat rat shit. I make records for me. When asked in the same interview about Berlin, he scoffed and said, my bullshit is other people's diamonds. But at least that album has some saving graces, which it did. Now, Lou Reed's career would have been over. Done. Everyone was absolutely done. However, there was a magazine called Punk Magazine, and their number one issue featured Lou Reed. Holstrom, who created the Punk Magazine, is quoted as saying, I saw Metal Machine Music as the beginning of the punk rock movement. It was the ultimate punk rock album. It was the greatest punk statement ever made. It was a fuck you to the recording company and everyone who bought it. It was, this is what I want to do the way I want to do it. How can you get more punk than that? It was more punk than the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, everything that came out afterwards. I think he meant it that way, and we treated it that way. And this got him the nomenclature of the godfather of punk. And that's when he released Take No Prisoners as a companion to Metal Machine Music, which was another live album. And that magazine got him back into it. And this was so influential that other artists did things very similar. David Bowie put out Tin Machine, which was an album that he wanted to do because he was also upset in the situation he was in. You know, it kind of just, everything kind of grew for Lou Reed after this album because of his underground appeal again. Like, this totally brought in his underground appeal. We can get into other albums that he did afterwards. Like, they consider Lulu a sequel to Metal Machine Music.
I actually like Lulu a lot.
Well, interestingly enough, Reed's widow, Laurie Anderson, said that about Lulu, it was really, this was really challenging, and I have a hard time with it. There are many struggles and so much radiance. And after Lou's death, David Bowie made a big point of me saying, listen, this is Lou's greatest work. This is going to be his masterpiece. Just wait. It will be like Berlin. It will take everyone a while to catch up. And Lulu was hated. And now, as you're saying, people are going back and going, wait, this is actually really good. So there's a positive take on that. Well, let's talk about a negative. And this comes to us from ultimateclassicrock.com. They hated this. Time hasn't healed, salvaged, redeemed, or vindicated the album in decades since its release. It's just as abrasive, confrontational, controversial, and difficult to listen to as it is now as it was then. But they do say that it does show semblance to modern day industrial, electronica, and avant-garde. You're absolutely right that I don't think industrial music, like this really is, for an album that is just sounds really, and it's not that bad. Like we said, there's melody in there, but this was the birth of a lot of different genres, because not that people are going to emulate exactly what Lou Reed did here.
No, they borrowed elements, and you can hear that. Like, if you listen to like Downward Spiral by Nine,
yes,
you listen to like a lot of like the sounds in this. A lot of that is like another layer over the actual music, you know, of like Reznor was doing. So yeah, this album, it's not bad. It's perfectly fine for an ambient type album. I think it's inspired a lot. I have my issues with Lou Reed in general.
Yes.
I mean, if the Mount Rushmore of fucking assholes in rock and roll, he's up there. He's on that mountain with Roger Waters, John Fogerty, just Axl Rose, like just giant egomaniacs that I just like. I enjoy their music, but like the more I learn about them and the older I get, the less I just don't give a shit about them. And I guess, and Lou Reed is again, he has so much music I like. I liked a lot of parts in this album too, but it's just, I think it's getting more hard to, especially if you really read into Lou Reed and his history. It's hard to divorce the artist from the art a lot of the times.
Yes. Yes.
But this, I did enjoy parts of this. Like, again, it reminded me a lot of the Ghosts album, a lot of like what Radiohead was doing in the early 2000s. The DNA, he put that out there, and it's great. Will I listen to this again? Well, we'll discuss that as we go.
Yeah. Yes. This really was like the big FU, and it was just him wanting to get away from really what bothered him wasn't necessarily the fame of it, right? It was what the record company was RCA was making him do. Again, dyeing his hair blonde, becoming this S&M leather boy.
Which was, he has been in his life. Let's not beat around the bush. Like that wasn't too far from a lot of his truths, but the label selling it like that, this could be considered probably the genesis of the "Fuck You" albums, which I think Neil Young especially saw something like this and just ran with it with the Geffen years. He was on David Geffen's label.
Yes. Now I can't remember which came first. Was Lou Reed's or Neil Young? I can't remember which.
The "Fuck You." Oh, this was before Neil Young started doing Young started doing that in the 80s.
Okay.
"Fuck You" albums. It was ahead of its time in a lot
of ways. A lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess at the time, the only thing I could compare it to would be like some of the weird ambient music that Lennon was doing with Yoko in the late 60s. But that was more sample heavy, I think, compared to this.
Yes.
Sample and loops, but it's kind of like, spiritually in the same vein.
I completely agree with that. I can't remember another band in that time that did a "Fuck You," right? Before this.
This is the first "Fuck You" album.
There's been some shenanigans with music before this, but
"Fuck You" songs before this.
Yes. Never a full-on album to fucking.
And if we're wrong, people let us know. I'm sure there have been "Fuck You" albums before this, but
yeah,
this one's like notable as really popularized the "Fuck You" albums. Which again, it works like that, but there are very interesting elements on this. It's not like a throwaway album, at least not in my view. Mm-mm. Maybe a Lou's view, but who knows.
And the interesting thing is that when you look at this, Coney Island Baby came out next.
It's pretty poppy sounding.
And that was on that was the last album he put out on RCA, mind you. And then he went to Arista, and he went to Arista for Rock and Roll Heart. RCA did put out a Best of Lou Reed album, but yeah, he basically put out most of his stuff on Arista going forward. But yeah, RCA was done after that. There was still one more album contractually, and I love Coney Island Baby, by the way.
Yeah, it's like the polar opposite of Metal Machine.
It is.
That's what I like about Lou Reed. He's like an artist. As much as I find that a lot of times so pretentious it makes me want to vomit, I got to give kudos to that though, because he did what he wanted. He did it his way. Fucking hats off to him.
Well, now let's talk about this, because this is where I have a hard time separating Lou Reed the musician from Lou Reed the person.
Yeah, it's hard.
Mm-hmm. It's hard because Lou Reed in real life, for a lot of his life, was not a great person. Now, in his older age, and once he got married to Laurie Anderson, he really turned his life around.
Yeah, he got really into like meditation and stuff like that. Just kind of he still had the edges, but they were softened a bit toward the end.
Yes. Just, looking at this and I love the idea behind it was that he was just so burnt out and so angry with the label and with the fans that he was gaining and seeing at the audiences that he was like, I'm going to put out the ultimate fuck you. I mean, and truthfully, I go back to that punk magazine, that #1, and it is probably the most punk thing anyone could have done. I mean, there's a lot of punk bands that could have done something like this at the time out of their angst and anger. But as we talked about before, the Sex Pistols were just a boy band.
Well, you have to remember, in 75, punk is still in its infancy for the most part. And so they didn't have the agency like Lou Reed did to put out something like this, unless they're going to do it independently, which kind of goes against the purpose of saying "fuck you" to a label.
This bothered RCA so much. Yeah, this is just. I mean, in my mind, the mythos of it has gotten out of control because in this thing, like in this one thing where it talks about the worst album ever made, they say even 5 minutes, only the strong-willed listeners are capable of making it through even 5 minutes without a skull-crushing migraine creeping up, and that comes from again ultimateclassicrock.com. Once you've heard 1 minute, you've pretty much heard it all. There's that. I mean,
well, it's weird. Another weird thing to me is. Even at this time, Frank Zappa had put out much weirder, stranger. They weren't "fuck you" albums because he didn't. I think that was like one of the weird things with Zappa is like he was so weird from the start that he could do whatever the fuck he wanted. Where Lou Reed kind of got trapped in that, Walk on the Wild Side, like this image of him.
Yes, I mean? Absolutely. Oh God, I want to do a Zappa album at some point, but we'll talk briefly about Zappa. Zappa. I mean, you go on YouTube, listeners, and you try to look at some of the interviews he had. They didn't know how to handle him. He had this niche group that he was able to make money on, right? He was able to make money from. They left that alone. What they wanted from Lou was more of the same. They wanted that glam rock thing. RCA was really making a killing off of glam rock.
Yeah, they wanted him as pretty much a darker Bowie.
Yep. And Lou, and you got to remember, this is a guy who was, again, running around the Velvet Underground and Andy Warhol. He looked at things as art. And if he wanted to make it as art came first for Lou. His want to do it came first, right?
Yep.
And when he quit wanting to do it and he still had these things to go to the record company, this is what you get. And it's surprising to me that when you really look at the way record companies were handling bands back in the day and like just the really horrible treatment of some of these people, that you didn't have something like this happen sooner.
Oh, absolutely. And I think people also have to remember, like, I think because it's been so long and Velvet Underground's been so, they're way more popular 40 years later, 50 years later than they were at the time. Like Lou Reed built his solo career without not a lot of people outside, record dorks and like New York really knew who the Velvet Underground was. Like their influence was more, it was bigger on like other bands until like, God, it was hard to, in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and until like the early 90s, it was not easy finding Velvet Underground records. Except for like bootleg.
Right. Absolutely.
So he's kind of builds this stuff up on his own. So it's not Lou Reed of the Velvet Underground when he's coming out with this album. It's Lou Reed of Transistor, Lou Reed of Walk on the Wild Side.
Well, and yeah, and God, you make such great points. I love it. And I can't really talk Lou with people like this. Most people like this. I am a big Lou Reed fan. But it's no surprise because as we're talking about Zappa, I'm also a huge Zappa fan. And there is this element of Lou that is his own beat. I mean, again, to go from the way that his albums go and how they're just completely different. People talk about what a chameleon Bowie was. And Bowie definitely was a chameleon. But Lou was even more so in my mind. I don't think there's anything Lou couldn't do.
No, and I think people also remember, like, Lou Reed was also a monster of a guitar player, too. Like, I think that also gets buried. Like, he was just, Bowie, Well, Bowie was more successful. That was just kind of it. But, like, if you look at, like, the stuff that they were doing, had such a huge impact. And especially, with Bowie, he pretty much gave us the Stooges, gave us Iggy Pop. And, like, so, like, between him and Lou Reed, like, I'm not saying they were the genesis of punk rock, because I think there was that mentality and way before those guys came along. Garage bands in the 60s, shit like that. But, like, they really put it on the map.
Yes. I completely agree with you that that was a special time, right? I mean,
it's the only time this could get away with, too. Can you imagine a Lou Reed?
No.
These days, like, the closest a lot of people think it's like a dumb comparison, but a guy who just does whatever he wants, and is also a guy that Lou Reed, before he died, says one of his favorite artists is Kanye West.
I can't imagine. I'm trying to think of an artist now that is a Lou Reed.
Yeah.
And I can't think of one.
No.
Can you?
The closest, like I said, would be the Kanye West. And that guy's just gone off the fucking rails. But he's done, like, such weird albums that I actually, like, Yeezy, if you listen to that, like, holy shit, that's fucking a weird record for a multi-platinum. So that was, like, one of Lou Reed's favorite albums before he died, which, it makes sense to me. Like, there's, like, a common thread, but the music industry now is so streamlined. Like, the 60s and 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, it was like the Wild West. Like, it wasn't exactly super difficult for people to get record labels, get a record contract. I mean, the contracts were shit. If you look at a lot of your favorite artists, they got screwed over in those days. But yeah, it's Lou Reed really, I could not see existing in today's music industry.
No. I'm trying to think of, because also the thing is that there's an outlet now for these, you could go independent, you don't have to be with a label anymore. Radiohead's putting out pretty much their own music through their site. There's ways of doing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You didn't have that back then. And I also think the perfect storm for this too was the record companies, although they were treating people horrible, they allowed for more creativity in a way,
Well, they weren't micromanaging. I think Zappa has a great quote about, like, how it was, like, back then it was just cigar chomping guys who were just like, yeah, whatever. We make money on it. Now it's just like, it's PR flax. And if you go even a slightly little dangerous, it just, the album just might not be released.
Yes. And that's part of it, is that it may not get released. You may have to go totally independent, right? In the 70s, people forget music was everywhere, right? It was, you had the glam, you had the disco was coming in, you still had that 60s, 70s sounds, rock was coming in, you're starting to see new punk, you're starting to see the emergence of heavier metal, soft rock,
yacht rock.
What's that?
Yacht rock.
Yeah, yacht rock. I mean, this is what was occurring, and you don't have that anymore.
Yeah, it's so streamlined. It's rare if you hear things that new artists, they all blend together. And, I don't know if that's just me cynical of my old age. Like, my dad or my parents are like, yeah, that crap all sounds the same to me. But it honestly feels like that these days. Like, everything has the auto-tune. It's the same beat a lot of the times. Yeah, but that sells, and they figure out how to make that sell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you can't have anything like this. I think, artists get now just cut. They just get cut out. I mean, I still couldn't imagine even in the 90s. Like Nirvana put out something close to this with In Utero. In a way, is kind of like a thing. But again, RCA kept the contract and put out Coney Island Baby before putting him on another label. Before he left. That would never happen. Willing
to take chances, though, that was the mentality back then. If this one doesn't sell, well, then maybe the next one will. No, unless you're, going solo, or you're not solo, but you're independent. And there was a lot of music I was listening to in the early 2000s, which was a lot kind of like this album. A lot of it was pasting sounds, random sound samples and all that. It was really interesting. But again, I was that's the DNA here of Metal Machine music. I think it inspired the right people, I think, and it turned off the right people.
Yes,
that was needed. I agree with Lou on that. That's there's a place for this album. It's just not for everybody.
Yes, and that I think is the key. And I think, again, circling back to what we talked about in the beginning, this is not as grating or as awful as the myth would have you believe.
Yeah, the myth is bigger than the actual product. I think more people are afraid to listen to it because of the myth.
Mm-hmm.
That was definitely my thing. Was oh God, if it's just as bad as what I think, well, what's the point? And I listened to it and I was oh, this isn't. It's not bad. It's not great to me. I mean, again, there's a lot of Lou Reed stuff that I prefer, but would I listen to it again? Maybe. I like to listen to a lot of ambient music when I'm working, so I'd probably throw it on. But it's just not my go-to. It wouldn't be my go-to. I got a list of other ambient, weird fucking music, and that's the thing is it spawned even weirder music, which I deeply appreciate, because a lot of the bands I was listening to, they were doing this soundscape shit with found audio or whatever. It wouldn't exist, really. It might, but not. It wouldn't be the same. And I think Lou would made it this album kind of showed you can do this. You can.
Mm-hmm. Yes. It showed that you absolutely can do this. And again, more artists did it. Neil Young famously. In a way, Kid A and Amnesiac was similar to what this was.
Yeah, I heard that DNA right away,
mm-hmm.
especially with Amnesiac. I think really, really, if it wasn't inspired, I think it was accidentally inspired. You know what I mean? I don't know enough about the making of that album, but I would not be surprised if they said Metal Machine music was one of their inspirations for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And but I also mean just in terms. I think it was because the story with what Tom York went through with the whole touring and everything. OK Computer. He was so burnt out, and the song I'm not Disappear, I think it is. Oh man, which track is it? Was actually basically a conversation between him and REM's frontman Michael Stipe. Which was, he was telling him, tell yourself you're not here. This isn't happening, to get yourself through it.
Yeah.
We've gone through a lot of it. Joe, anything else you want to say?
No. Again, this is an interesting album. I will, again, I don't know how often I'd listen to it again. Of all the post Velvet Underground solo works, my favorite is a weird track by John Cale. Who's as I'm reading up on this on Wikipedia, one of John Cale's artistic works in the mid-60s was also an inspiration on that. Cale worked with Lou Reed with Velvet Underground. Two famously really didn't get along, but yet they recorded an album 1989 together. I just want to say just because it's such a weird track is Paris 1919. I love that track. It's so fucking bizarre.
Yes, that is that is an absolutely bizarre track.
And it's so catchy. But yeah, so like, Metal Machine music isn't in my top 10 post Velvet Underground things. Paris 1919, Lulu would probably be my top 2.
Mm-hmm.
But Rock and Roll Animal I love, even though it was hell for Lou to put it out. But God, I fucking care. It's such a good album.
It's a great. It really is. It's a great album. It's a great album. But yeah, he was so messed up on heroin and booze and everything, doing that. I mean,
you could describe his entire existence from 1971 to like early 1980s as fucked up.
And if you think about it, I mean, it's not a long, the Lou Reed Live is that album is not very long, right? Now Rock and Roll Animal though is awesome. You had, I mean, when it came out though, it was really only 5 tracks.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. It was on its initial release. It was only the intro to Sweet Jane, Heroin, White Light, White Heat, Lady Day, and Rock and Roll. The remaster
super long.
Right. Well, Rock and Roll was 10 minutes and Heroin's 13 minutes. So you still got about a 35-minute album of it. But the remaster added Caroline Says, How Do You Think It Feels? They added some more stuff off of Berlin that RCA did not want on it. So yeah, when you think about that, they took some stuff off of it at the time that they were like, this isn't going to add to the album and this is going to alienate people, these songs like that, because they didn't like Berlin.
God forbid he'd alienate people songs like Heroin on an album. Oh, dear God.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's an interesting album. Again, the DNA here inspired a lot of music I really enjoyed over the years. A lot of the bands I think were inspired by this. I can't confirm if they were, but I'm 99% sure.
Oh, yeah. I think again, for the first time listening to it, you heard it right. Like I heard Nine Inch Nails in there. I heard Industrial. I heard the Kid A. I even hear that you thought was synth in there, and that's just really that guitar and that sound. I think absolutely. I think every one of the things that you think did it because again, much like we talked about with some of our other albums, where they're music for musicians. I think musicians know the legend of this and sought this out. Yeah. Or do you disagree?
No, I think you're 100% on that.
So with that, would you recommend it?
Absolutely. It's an interesting album. I think, again, the legend of it is more imposing than it actually is. It has its moments where I really enjoy it. Sometimes it's difficult to listen to, but it's coming from an artist, and a lot of times art is not always comfortable. So yeah, I would say I would recommend it. It's not your typical Lou Reed, but I think if you're listening to Metal Machine music, I don't think you're going in it completely blind, and if you are, that will be one hell of a fucking weird experience.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going to say with this as well, is that do I recommend it? There's a giant asterisk on my recommendation for this. Yes, I do. I wanted you to understand that you may not, as a listener, you may not hear the things that Joe and I hear. You may not hear that melody. You may only hear the noise. I mean, again, ultimateclassicrock.com cannot hear anything but a migraine-inducing noise to it, which is really unusual to me because I think in today's electronica and of that nature, it's there. That article is
dub bass or whatever. I find that probably way more grating than dubstep or whatever that fucking whatever that Skrillex guy is.
And Skrillex does have some things I like, but there is some definite to that too. If you
like the DNA of this is in that too,
Yeah, if you like dubstep, you're gonna probably find stuff in this and be like, wow, this is You may even find it somewhat boring, honestly, based upon the legend. You might be like, wow, this is all it is. Because
that's kind of where I was.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest with you, it's been a long time since I've heard this album. I think I heard this album 18, 20 years ago when I used to hang out with these neo beatniks and people that were really into the Velvet Underground and that whole scene, Andy Warhol and that type of thing, and Lou Reed, a kind of a modern glam, as it were. It's not as outrageous as people think it is. It's definitely way tamer.
Not outrageous, but it's not as interesting either, I would say.
Yeah, it's not as interesting as the story would have you think it is. I mean, when you hear about it, I think of like him just jamming and this feedback and this horrible noise, and you don't really get a lot of that. It's not all that overly loud. And again, you can pick out some really cool melodies in there. And I think that just happened because as a musician, you're going to, like, when you're messing with that stuff, even if you're trying not to do it, you're going to find yourself doing it at some point because it's just ingrained in you as a musician. It's hard to write things with no melody.
Yeah. No, it is. And you pick them up. It's buried in the mix a lot of the times, but it's there. I heard it. So
I like it because I also really love the story around it. I think that also adds to it. Like, knowing that this was like the original fuck you to a record label really adds to, like, wow. Like, and again, picturing Lou Reed demanding to go to the president of RCA Records and hand it to him personally. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's some balls. That's, it's not Kiss doing music from the Elder.
No, it's not Kiss doing music from the Elder.
Which I'm glad you piggybacked off that because, he wrote some lyrics on that piece of shit album.
Oh, yeah. No, he did. So, yeah, I would recommend this with a caveat. So that is, Metal Machine music. I always want to call it machine metal music, but it's Metal Machine music. You gave me Kiss. I gave you Metal Machine music. Joe, your pick next week. Where are you going from there?
We're going to go to the 70s again.
Okay.
We're going to a band from Detroit, Michigan. We're relatively unknown until around 2009 when their demos for an album were finally released by an indie label. The band is called Death. The album's called For the Whole World to See. It's interesting. There's an interesting story behind this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just check my music source here. 1 second. All right. I got 7 tracks. Does that sound about right?
Yep. 7 tracks. Perfect. 7 tracks of proto-punk music. It's an interesting a documentary came out on them before that album came out, which kind of explains it a lot more. But yeah, this is an interesting album in that it was released in 2009. It was supposed to come out in 75, and it's an interesting story of how it got to that. Because when you listen to it, you're like, this album should have been released. There's no reason why this album should not have been released.
I'm really interested to hear this because I think I've heard something about it, but I know absolutely nothing about them, about the album. So I'm going to do the same thing you did. I'm going to go in completely blind. I'm not going to look up anything other than hearing the album. So I'm really looking forward to that because I like that idea. I love doing that where I have to admit, it's not often I get challenged on music I've never heard before. And in doing this podcast with you, it's invigorated something that I loved doing in my teens and my 20s when I really had the time, which was digging in and just looking at albums or looking at things and being like, I wonder what that is, and hearing it for the first time and being able to get into it. So I'm looking forward to this. Plugs, Joe, what do you got going on?
Next week, I'm making Brown go home and get his fucking shine box because we're doing Goodfellas.
Oh, yes, that's right. The shine box.
Yeah.
Goodfellas. I'm looking forward to that.
So that's what we have going on for the Joe Down. It's just been kind of hectic, so it's been our reviews have been pushed a week. So
And you know what? Honestly, by the time people hear this, it's going to be off anyway. That one will be out for a while. But it's still good to know where we were. Like, go back and check out some of the older articles in the Jodown. Go deep into it and check some of the other libraries. Joe, how long have you had the Jodown website up?
Since 2016, so almost 5 years now that we've been doing this. So the actual Jodown website, probably like 3 years now. It's kind of started on our work company's website, and we just kind of decided to go on our own. So, yeah. Yep. So what's going on with you, Paul? What do you got coming up?
Well, as of right now, this recording, I just finished editing the legit first episode of season 2 for Cast That Movie. Lots of changes in there. So that's all I got, buddy. Other than that, do you want to take us out?
In the spirit of Lou Reed, no.